Good evening, everyone. My name is Leif Douch. I am your moderator tonight, and I am one of the co-chairs of the California Lawyers Association's Racial Justice Committee. I really appreciate you all joining us and spending some time with us on a rainy Thursday evening, at least for those of us in the Bay Area. Tonight's panel is titled Judaism, Law, and Social Change. And we're honored to have co-sponsors tonight, the Jewish Bar Association of San Francisco, the Jewish Bar Association of Orange County, and the Leonard M. Friedman Bar Association of Sacramento. But before we start our program, I would like to turn things over to our amazing CEO and Executive Director here at the California Lawyers Association, and a major champion of our Racial Justice Committee, Ona Dosunmu.
Thanks, Leif. I appreciate it. And thank you to our extraordinary co-sponsors and to this awesome panel. I wanted to say a few words at the top. I don't always sort of barge in on the Racial Justice Committee programming, but this is the first program for the year 2021. And I don't know about others in the audience. I certainly breathed a huge sigh of relief when 2020 was in the rear view mirror, but apparently the joke was on me because on the first Wednesday of the month of January of 2021, a violent mob invaded the US Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the democratic process. On the second Wednesday of 2021, the House voted to impeach the former president for his role in the events of the prior week. And on the third Wednesday, as a relative of mine tweeted to me, and dawn comes in the morning, we did finally experience a peaceful transition of power in the White House. And part of the team that was inaugurated included the first woman, the first South Asian, and the first Black vice president who happens to be married to a Jewish man. Those of us who are paying attention and sort of watching current events probably could have guessed, maybe not at the magnitude, but guessed that something dire might happen after the events that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in August of 2017. I could talk about the shooting of a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, or I could talk about the shooting of the Tree of Life Synagogue. I won't. But if you're wondering, sort of why I'm reciting history that probably most participants in this program are well familiar with, it's to make the following point. The Charlottesville mob was carrying both Nazi and Confederate flags. The mob that invaded the Capitol on the 6th carried Confederate flags, and some of them sported Camp Auschwitz t-shirts and other Nazi insignia. And the work that the Racial Justice Committee and our co-sponsors and our panelists are engaged in is, frankly, in my view, essential to the survival of the United States as a multicultural constitutional democracy. The work is not a zero-sum game. In fact, we're all on the ship that we call America, and we will succeed or fail together. And the values that we're fighting for are extraordinarily important. I also think allyship is important. In my mind, allyship doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean we're 100% aligned on every issue all the time, but it does require an open heart, an open mind, willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. And on that note, I'm eager to listen and to learn from our panel. And I sign off again with deep thanks to our co-sponsors, to the Racial Justice Committee and the work that they're doing, and to our panel. Over to you, Leif. Thank you.
Thank you, Ona, for those inspiring words and for your support of this committee and our work. In terms of format for tonight, I'm going to introduce our three fantastic speakers. Then we're going to have about an hour-long presentation, followed by about 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A. So whether throughout the program or at the end, please do use that Q&A box down in the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom screen to submit any questions you have. Our first speaker is Stan Levy. Stan has co-founded and led numerous legal services organizations in California, including the Western Center on Law and Poverty, Public Counsel, and Betsadec Legal Services of Los Angeles. He has served as general counsel of the Guest Company, senior counsel of Manat, Phelps, and Phillips, and he is now the general counsel of Working Nation. He teaches at Loyola Law School in LA and has been named the Attorney of the Year by California Lawyer magazine. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you.
Next, we have Marlene Tressman. Marlene worked for over 30 years in the Maryland Attorney General's office, serving as a special assistant to several AGs. She has taught at Loyola University of Maryland and is the author of Fair Labor Lawyer, The Remarkable Life of New Deal Attorney and Supreme Court Advocate Bessie Margolin. Marlene has received too many grants and fellowships for me to list here tonight, but they include awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Supreme Court Historical Society. Welcome, Marlene. And finally, we have Seth Brisk. Seth is the Anti-Defamation League's regional director for the Central Pacific, which serves Northern California, Utah, and Hawaii. Previously, Seth held leadership roles with the American Jewish Committee and JCRC Boston, and was the executive director of San Francisco Hillel. He served in the Israel Defense Forces, and in 2013, the Republic of Poland honored him as an officer of the Order of Merit, which has to be the coolest honorific of the night. If this were part of a normal in-person program, this would be the time where I ask everyone to join me in a big round of applause, welcoming our speakers. But we are living in anything but normal times, so let's just jump in. Stan, the first question is to you. As I mentioned in your introduction, you've played a key role in founding several legal services organizations here in California. Can you tell us a bit about what societal issues those groups were focused on and what motivated you to get involved?
Sure. I just wanted to say in the beginning, to follow up on Ona's comment, a couple of years before the incidents that she talked about, there was an incident, anti-Semitic incident in Whitefish, Montana, that I was involved in, and in talking to people from the Anti-Defamation League and Southern Poverty Law Center, they said this is just the first in a salvo of what will be an attack on all kinds of principles in the United States, and that has proven to be true. So let me give a little bit of setting to this evening. So yesterday was the United Nations Holocaust Remembrance Day, celebrating or commemorating the liberation of Auschwitz in 1945 by the Russian troops. Today is a Jewish holiday called Tu B'Shvat, which is the Jewish Environmental Awareness Day. So in terms of our environment today, we have to acknowledge that of COVID-19 deaths in the United States, there are now over 430 deaths in the United States and over 2.2 million deaths worldwide. And we are here tonight, 3 weeks after the coup to overthrow the government of the United States by the forceful armed capture and occupation of the United States Congress while both houses were in sessions. And we are clearly in the midst of a new civil war in this country, with hatred and violence at its very core. And I would like to begin by reading a passage that a Rabbi Harold Schulweis wrote in 2008. He said, "Democracies are not exempt from totalitarianism and tyranny. Was what happened during the Holocaust so extraordinary that such cruelty could take place only in the fog of war and only in the sinister shadow of totalitarianism? Could cruelty happen under the banner of peace and beneath the flag of our democracy?" And we have certainly seen that come true. So the things that shaped my life. I was born on December 12, 1941. That was the day German Chancellor Adolf Hitler issued an executive order to his cabinet, as he had warned for over a year, to develop and execute a plan and official German government program to annihilate the Jewish people from Germany and all territories under German control, as a response and punishment for the United States having just declared war on Germany. Within 4 years, Germany systematically exterminated what we now know to be over 7 million Jewish people, along with millions of other people. That event has been a major event that has shaped my lives. One of the classes which I still teach now is I do teach a class in Holocaust law and the Nuremberg trials and the effect of that. I was born and raised on the southwest side of Chicago. My family moved to Los Angeles when I was about 10. And in my late teenage years, I studied with, among other rabbis of all Jewish denominations, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, from whom I learned that an act is unjust, not because a law has been broken, but because people have been hurt. As we all know now, Rabbi Heschel and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became friends, and they studied together, prayed together, and marched together in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So that was when I began to study the teachings of Reverend King. My religious education from all of my rabbis and teachers, both in Chicago and Los Angeles, including Orthodox, Hasidic, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist teachers, all emphasized the teachings of the Hebrew Bible, and especially the teachings, the mitzvot of the Torah, which were addressed to me personally and all of us to respond to. And that meant standing up for justice and standing against injustice. That the Hebrew people were an Arab tribe from the Middle East on the Syrian-Iraqi border, and we were immigrants and refugees, and that along with the Hebrews who escaped from 400 years of slavery in Egypt, there was a mixed multitude of nationalities, mainly other African tribes, who escaped from slavery with us then, and went through the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness with us, and then when we occupied a portion of the land of Canaan in that time. And that also became a major shape of my life. And so our religion teaches that our laws protect the most vulnerable members of society, the poor, the elderly, the orphans, immigrants, and refugees among us. That our laws must be the same for citizens and for immigrants wherever we are. That we have to love people who are near us, our neighbors, and immigrants among us as we love ourselves. For we were immigrants in Egypt, and we know how it feels to live in slave-like conditions and be marginalized from outside mainstream society. We must never be an innocent bystander and must intervene when someone's life is in danger. We must speak out, intervene, and protect them. That God prays to each of us personally to bring justice, including economic justice and community justice, into our world, to stand up for and side by side with people in need. That God intervenes in the world only through people. We are not a religion of faith, we are a religion of action, and only we can bring justice and peace to our world. In the summer of 1965, I graduated from law school. That was the summer of the Watts riots, and that was an event which had a significant change in my life and the course of my life. I continued my rabbinic studies, and in 1968, I was ordained as a rabbi and have always pursued both careers simultaneously. The three organizations I founded are thriving organizations today, 50 years later, using their staff attorneys and support staff and pro bono lawyers from scores of law firms and the corporate law departments. They collectively represent somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people a year. They have, in their class action litigation and legislative advocacy, changed the legal landscape in California in public education, in voting rights, and against gerrymandering, in Holocaust reparations rights, immigration and asylum rights, consumer rights, protection of elderly abuse, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and established the private legal and business community support for legal services programs, public interest law firms, and pro bono law. And the change in legal education, when I was teaching, also included all those changes in public interest law, civil rights law, political rights law, women's rights law, systemic racism law, and Holocaust and genocide studies, and others as well. And I have had also, fortunately, since just before 1980, a great career in commercial and business law as well. And I feel very privileged to have lived the life that I lived. That's why I do what I did. And I continue to do. I still work with all three organizations. And I feel truly blessed with the life that I've had and the law that I practiced, and the fact that I'm still teaching in my congregation and in the seminary that I founded over 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Covered a lot of ground in there, and look forward to unpacking that over the course of the next hour. Marlene, I wanted to turn to you next. As Stan mentioned, there's a long history of American Jews and Jewish attorneys working and fighting for civil rights in this country. And a lot's been written about that, whether it's talking about the role that American Jews played in founding the NAACP, or some of the iconic images. Stan mentioned one, of Rabbi Abraham Heschel marching arm in arm over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma with Martin Luther King Jr. But you chose to write a book about a Jewish attorney who lived a remarkable life and played a foundational role in a different area, and that's labor law. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the life and work of Bessie Margolin, and also what inspired you to tell her story.
Sure. Thanks, Leif. And I also want to start off by thanking the California Lawyers Association and my impressive co-panelists. I'm here not to talk about my own life, but I'm honored to carry the briefcase, the formidable briefcase of Bessie Margolin. I'll tell you a little bit about her. I call it Bessie 101, and I do hope that you'll take time to learn more about her. That was my goal in leaving the Maryland Attorney General's office and writing the book. I'll start off by saying that before there was the notorious RBG of blessed memory, there was the audacious Bessie Margolin. And I wrote Fair Labor Lawyer to restore this woman, or put her for the first time into our nation's history. She and I shared childhood experiences growing up as dependent children. I as a full orphan, she is a half orphan in New Orleans, and that's how we got to know each other. And it really is born from tzedakah, from true social justice. Caring for widows and orphans is repeated no fewer than 36 times in the Torah. And I think it's fair to say that today we look at that, or should look at that, as caring for those least able to care for themselves in our society. Bessie's life spanned the 20th century. She was born in 1909 in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. She was the first American-born daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants. Her mother died when she was quite young, and the family's plight became known to a rabbi who petitioned for the children to be admitted in 1913 to the Jewish Orphans Home in New Orleans, which many people do not know, and I hope they will soon because I'm working on that book now. And that is that the Orphans Home in New Orleans, the Jewish Orphans Home in New Orleans, was the first purpose-built Jewish orphanage in the nation, built in 1856. When Bessie arrived in 1913, And if I could, Brianna, if you could put up that next slide. And you'll see what Bessie and her siblings look like with their father, Harry Margolin. And on the right is a picture of the Jewish Orphans Home as it looked until the mid 1950s in New Orleans, on one of the city's most prosperous and beautiful thoroughfares, St. Charles Avenue. There was nothing that was not done that could be done for these children. This place was a monument to Hebrew benevolence. And it was born as much from the biblical mandate to care for orphans and widows as it was to defend against anti-Semitism that was always lurking wherever Jews were present in the country. But there, while Bessie grew up in this home, steeped in a pious Reform Judaism in the synagogue that was in the home itself, it was a place where rabbis and spiritual leaders would come to talk about philanthropy and social justice in its most basic forms. It's somewhat apocryphal that when Bessie was very small, one of the annual orations spoke of making sure that that problems in the industrial world should be taken care of to prevent the orphanhood that they were dealing with. The idea of actually addressing root causes was something that was very much instilled and inculcated, not only through the home to the community, but in the children themselves. Not content to raise these children with mere subsistence, Bessie benefited from the wealth and the generosity of the New Orleans Jewish community. And she was given the opportunity to go to one of the finest and still one of the finest schools in New Orleans, the Isidore Newman School, built for those Jewish orphans, but also open to all children of parents who could pay. And I'll caveat that the school was founded in 1903, so unfortunately they were not talking about Black children, which is a sorrowful thing. But it was open to white children of New Orleans from the community whose parents could pay to send them there. So in this environment, which quickly became a prestigious prep school, Bessie thrived in this co-ed rigorous academic environment. She graduated from Newman as the valedictorian, winning a scholarship to Newcomb. While at Newcomb, not satisfied to simply be getting a liberal arts education, she transfers herself to Tulane, and within a total of 5 years gets both degrees. She's second in her, the only woman, and second in her law school class. She's Order of the Coif when they finally initiated it, and she's editor of the Civil Law Review, civil law editor, which was quite prestigious then. When she graduated in 1930, and Brianna, if you could put up that next slide, I'd like you to see what it looked like in 1930 when Bessie took her oath at the bar. And this would basically be Bessie's career the rest of her life. That is, she would be usually the first and often the only woman in a room. She was not the first woman admitted to the Louisiana bar, but you can see in this room, there she is by herself. She manages to get herself to Yale Law School, where she becomes the first woman awarded Yale's Sterling Fellowship, which she uses to get her doctorate in law. And fortunate to be studying under William O. Douglas, which portended great things for her career. She ends up at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which FDR has just created to bring electricity to the most impoverished residents, among the most impoverished residents of our country. She, while there, was the only woman on the brilliant legal team that defended FDR's New Deal, and in particular, the TVA. After working and being credited with shaping the briefs that defended the constitutionality of the FDA, of the TVA, Bessie made her way to the Labor Department, where Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet secretary, was just giving life to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Bessie was the first woman hired in the wage and hour division, and it began what would become more than 30 years of her life. By the time she retired, she'd be credited with putting the flesh and sinews on the bare bones of this act. And she became the architect of the Fair Labor Standards Act. She ended up arguing at the Supreme Court 24 times, one of only 3 women in the 20th century to do that. And I have to check the records, but I think still one of only 8 women to this day to have argued 24 times in the Supreme Court. And with each case, she brought the dignity of these workers and the plight of the wage and hour laws and the problems with enforcement. There wasn't any aspect of the law that wasn't challenged, and she was there at every step of the way. Right after, in 1945, she became very interested in a new pursuit. And if you'll put on the next slide, Brianna, she had heard that Justice Robert H. Jackson, whom she'd already appeared at the Supreme Court twice, had taken leave from the bench and had become the chief U.S. prosecutor for Nazi war crimes in Nuremberg. He turned Bessie down when she first asked to join him in the first prosecution, or the prosecution of the first case. But when it was time for the subsequent proceedings, as they became known, she was handpicked by Telford Taylor, the general who oversaw those trials. And she was tasked as a very senior and brilliant lawyer from a federal attorney with the job of drafting the rules for what became the subsequent proceedings under the American military tribunals. While she was there, she not only witnessed the prosecution of the first 24 top Nazis, she also was there as Robert Jackson gave the historic closing arguments. And she wrote to others that she was shocked and appalled by the Nazis' shocking and nauseating crimes and doctrines. And she vowed that, quote, "Any little weight I may carry should be thrown in the direction of increasing the number of Nazis to be prosecuted for murder," end quote. So this woman, the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, fulfilled that job. And with the rules she drafted, more than 200 of the trials went forward. And these are the cases that are most familiar to us, the ones of the industrialists, the doctors, and the judges. So she could take great satisfaction that she had thrown her weight in that regard. If you could put up the next slide, Brianna. When she returned to the Labor Department, she brought all of her weight to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And despite her quest for a judgeship, which she desperately coveted, she was passed over for 7 different opportunities. Her name was discussed in the White House by LBJ. In fact, he referred to her as that Jewish woman and he asked whether she might be a little too dangerous for the job. She didn't get it, and there were all sorts of reasons it could have been, and I'll leave you to read my book to see a few of the others. But the silver lining when she didn't get the judgeship is that she was there when the Equal Pay Act was passed and signed into law, as well as the Age Discrimination and Employment Act signed into law, and those became her bailiwick. She was responsible, in addition to the Fair Labor Standards Act oversight and litigation, for those 2 laws as well. By the time she retired, she had overseen and personally participated in over 300 Equal Pay Act trials, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of employees across the nation and earning the title of the #1 fighter for equal pay for women. This slide is a compilation of photos and other mementos from her retirement dinner in 1972, where Chief Justice Earl Warren, then retired, was the master of ceremonies, and also attended by 3 other justices, 2 former justices, Arthur Goldberg and Abe Fortas at that time, and of course her old mentor, William O. Douglas, before whom she'd argued all 24 of her cases. She had an amazing, amazing career. There's lots we can talk about, lessons to be learned from her life, lots of really good lessons. And I think in terms of what she faced, it wasn't always that she was doing it for other women, but she always brought other women along with her. And when the Equal Pay Act became her responsibility, she finally took on and understood with a fervor what equality for women was about, and ended up being one of the founding members of NOW, the National Organization for Women, although she considered herself a reluctant feminist. So I'll be happy to talk more about her in the questions, and thanks again for allowing me to carry her briefcase to this event.
Thank you, Marlene. I have to plead ignorance that before we started to put together this panel, I had never heard of Bessie Margolin. So thank you so much for telling her story and bringing some much deserved light to her work. Now, Seth, we have heard 2 very inspiring and optimistic responses so far, so I don't want to bring things down too much. But of course, the Jewish experience in America and elsewhere has not been all rainbows and butterflies. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the founding and the mission of ADL and some of the work that you're most proud of.
Sure. Well, thank you, Leif. Thank you, Ona, for inviting me. Thank you to the California Lawyers Association for hosting this important discussion. And I'm honored and humbled to be here and a panelist with such giants in this area. So I do want to just give a brief introduction to the work that ADL does, and maybe make some linkages with the various topics that we're talking about here: Judaism, law, and social change. So Brianna, next slide. So many of you know ADL was founded in 1913, and here's a copy of the original charter. And ever since our founding, our mission has been to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. So interesting that in 1913, while most people recognize and understand ADL as a leader in confronting anti-Semitism and different forms of hate that are directed at the Jewish community, that we've always been committed to a mission to support all different communities, anyone who might be the subject of bias or bigotry. And if you think about it, it's a modern incarnation of Hillel's dictum: if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? So ADL understood very early on that that was going to be a necessary aspect to the fight. It made strategic sense to bring in allies, but it also made a certain ethical sense, a moral sense, as envisioned by Hillel. And even from that very early moment, again, if you look at that original document, it talks about accomplishing the work of the Anti-Defamation League by appeals to reason, and failing that, appeals to the law. And so the law plays a critical role here, not only because it's an aspect of Jewish tradition, but also because it was clear and understood that this would be an important element in the work that ADL would do. And again, remember, at the time, 1913, Jim Crow is firmly entrenched. Women do not have the right to vote. There are so many social ills and issues of social justice that are confronting America at the time. And yet this audacious group of people, really at the time men, were getting together and willing to take on not only a fight on behalf of their own community, but on behalf of other communities. Next slide. So it started with, in the upper left-hand corner that you see there, Sigmund Livingston, who was an attorney in Chicago, who started the Anti-Defamation League with a budget of $200 and 2 desks in his law office. And I have his book there, Must Men Hate? Again, this is the chauvinism of the day in which he lived. to illustrate the notion that while he was consumed with and clearly concerned about anti-Semitism, which was rampant in American society, it was very clear in everything that ADL did that it was important to address all different forms of hate. And, you know, even as, again, at the time of ADL's founding in 1913, this was during the time of the trial and eventual lynching, the only documented lynching in American history of a Jew, Leo Frank. It was clear that there was going to be a broader mission to address issues of social justice and social change. Now, in the bottom corner, I show you some ways in which our organization set about to make that social change through the law. So the first case is actually the first amicus brief that was filed on behalf of the American Jewish Committee. As Leif mentioned during the introduction, I used to work for the AJC. This is in 1923, and I'm not an attorney, and I probably don't need to tell the rest of you, but for those who may need a refresher, Pierce forms the basis for personal civil liberties. It's been cited in over 100 cases before the Supreme Court, including Roe versus Wade. And notably, for a Jewish organization, in this case, the American Jewish Committee, they chose to initiate their work in the court system, in the appellate system, in a case that did not really involve the Jews. It was about personal freedom. It was about personal freedom of access to education, and underscoring the notion of personal civil liberties. Now, ADL's first amicus brief was in Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. And again, probably don't need to tell you all about it, but here again, we have a case that really didn't directly involve the Jewish community. Certainly it was something that an issue that the community could relate to, but this case involved housing discrimination that was being visited upon African-American families. Again, significant that ADL chose that this would be its first amicus brief, and an indication of the importance of the work that we do on behalf of others that may or may not benefit us, but really truly benefits all of us because it makes America a better place. I didn't mention Brown versus Board of Education, where both agencies were deeply involved, but there are numerous cases, and every year ADL is filing amicus briefs in the court. You can go and find it on our website and look at those various briefs on a number of different issues that affect civil rights and civil liberties. Now, in terms of the law, you see here I mentioned the anti-masking law. This was a law that came about and that ADL championed in the 1950s, ended up being passed in a half dozen states in the South and 50 other communities, that really led to the decimation of the Ku Klux Klan. And it simply stated that you have a First Amendment right to march through town and proclaim your racist views. But if you do that, you have to take off your mask. You have to own the hate that you're willing to profess. So because of these laws, it really led to the decimation of the Ku Klux Klan as we know it. It had gone through a certain resurgence at that time, and the membership dropped precipitously following the enactment of this law. Now, interesting fact, recently, because of the pandemic and because of some of the orders about wearing masks, there have had to be some jurisdictions have actually suspended these anti-masking laws simply for the purpose of allowing people to maintain social distance and health protocols. ADL is also particularly proud of our role in the advent and in the championing of hate crime law. We have drafted a model statute, which is in use in 46 states and the District of Columbia. And it's based on this belief that, and this understanding that hate crime law is necessary because a crime which is wholly or largely motivated on the part of somebody because they're targeting somebody on the basis of their membership in a protected class, it's a message crime. It's not simply a crime which affects the person who's that specific target or victim, but rather it's a crime that is going to send a message and it's going to be felt and meant to terrorize entire groups of people who may be members of that class, whether it's on the basis of their gender, on their religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, what have you. And so ADL, since the 1980s, really innovated the concept of hate crime law and has been championing it ever since. And I was privileged enough to be part of the effort to pass a hate crime law in Utah in 2019, which covered all of those classes that I just mentioned. The last thing I'll just mention on this slide is the picture that you see before you. This is at the time of the signing of the Civil Rights Act. You see some familiar faces there, but the gentleman in the front row in the light colored suit, who's standing next to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is Ben Epstein, who at the time was the national director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. So we're very proud of that work that we've done and the role that we've played in this work. I think at this point, I'm just I'll pause. I think we'll talk maybe a little bit later about the state of hate, the state of anti-Semitism, and the challenges that lie ahead.
Thank you, Seth. And it just goes to show what bizarre times we're living in, that when you first said anti-mask law, my mind immediately went to coronavirus and not to the KKK. So hopefully at some point in the future, we can focus on the bigger masking priorities than what we're going through right now, but strange times indeed. Now, Stan, you mentioned that you, in addition to being an attorney, are a rabbi, and you touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about the role that your faith and Jewish faith more broadly has had in influencing people to pursue careers in social justice.
Well, as I said, I understood from all my teachers that this was my personal responsibility as a Jew to pursue justice and fight against injustice under any circumstances. And that became an important part of my life's mission. I said there were two lenses through which I look at the world. One is the Holocaust, and the second is Jewish law about treatment of immigrants, treatment of men, of women, of people of other religions, of other races, of other nationalities, all those kinds of things. That's why I did what I did. And again, to try to find a balance in life between doing that, teaching religion that way, teaching classes in theology, teaching classes in ethics, teaching classes in social justice, in religion, anti-Semitism, dealing with anti-Semitism at the seminary where I am. And the one other thing which I wanted to mention here was there was a film which the United States Army had developed of the Nuremberg trial that had Justice Jackson's final argument. All the defendants had a chance to present their cases, or their attorneys did. And that case was banned by the U.S. State Department, then called the War Department, because of the fact that Germany was now our ally after the war and Russia was our enemy. Never shown here, but it has been reconstructed and put out, and it is called Nuremberg, Its Lessons for Today. This is one of the films which I have taught in a number of different law schools here and to other community organizations to see these scenes from the actual trial. Very, very powerful. But as I said, these are the events that really shaped my life. It was through my religion that I did this. And I wanted to say that in the early days of my civil rights career, most of the time I spent dealing with Black American organizations and individuals and Hispanic American organizations and individuals about their issues of civil rights, racism in the United States. And to say personally, I never, ever felt threatened or experienced any anti-Semitism coming from them. I did in college, especially experienced a lot of anti-Semitism from white Christian kids in school, in UCLA, in the late 50s and early 1960s when I was there. I hope that kind of answers the question.
It absolutely did. And I appreciate the recommendation about that film. I want to check that out.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and it's really worth getting. And again, lawyers, people in media, about how to make a great documentary film and show this story. It's chilling to watch it. Yep.
Sure. Marlene, similar question to you. And again, feel free to answer both in terms of your own life and Bessie's. But how, how has faith influenced your life and your work, and how did Bessie talk about it, if she did at all?
Well, it is interesting. Bessie, as an adult, was not what anyone would call an observant Jew, but she was Jewish and she acknowledged it. And more importantly, I think for both Jews and other people who are the subject of hate and discrimination, the world saw her as Jewish. When she applied to Yale for what she thought was a job or a fellowship, it was met with the very discreet quotas of the time, and the registrar asked the dean of the law school, who was really pushing Bessie forward, is she Jewish? And the dean of Tulane Law School, who himself was a Yale Law School graduate, knew that Bessie's future depended on his answer to the question about his great student. And so he wrote, I wish it was the perfect example of benign anti-Semitism in her favor. I wish to state, however, yes, she is, he said, I wish to state, however, that she has none of the characteristics that mark some of the people of that race as offensive. And he went on through his own ignorance to distinguish her from those New York type Jews, which in fact she was, if she was any type of Jew, and say that the people at Yale probably weren't as aware of the Sephardic type of Jew that New Orleans had a lot of, and that somehow they were less offensive. And so I'm not even sure Bessie was aware of that particular fiasco, because it didn't come from her papers. I got it from Yale's papers. And like I said, the way that Lyndon Johnson, when she was being considered in the White House for a federal appellate judgeship or for the Court of Claims, referred to her as that Jewish woman, it was affecting her life. Her Nuremberg time, I think, though, was something that, again, I can't swear that it was only or predominantly through a Jewish lens, but it was from a human lens. And the fact that while she was there, working to respond to the atrocities that had happened, that she became very close friends, and it sparked a lifelong friendship with Morris Abram, who became the president of the American Jewish Committee and president of Brandeis, and said that Nuremberg, his time at Nuremberg, really was an inspiration for what he did going forward. Those were times where Bessie and Morris Abram and one of their very good friends from the French prosecution team always spoke of those times as very special, because they felt it was tangible. They were helping to shape destiny, human destiny. And I think Bessie did understand her role in helping to shape destiny, the kind of dignity that she brought to the most dirty and menial of jobs that she was representing at the Supreme Court, courts across the country, was a dignity of work, something I think that is at its heart social justice. Again, she didn't speak of these things in a Jewish way, but they so closely align with the basic tenets of tzedek, of social justice, and what we now much more commonly talk about is tikkun olam, repairing the world, that I'd like to think, if I could have the conversation with her today, that she would have no problem seeing it in that light. So I think that's how I'll address that. For me, I'll tell you, for Judaism really is one of philanthropy and tzedek. As I said, my own background, I was orphaned before I was 11, and had the Jewish orphanage in New Orleans not closed, I would have lived there. What I was instilled in me was the kind of responsibility we have for the community and for those who are least able to care for themselves. And I hope I brought that with me to my work in the Attorney General's office, the last decade of which I spent on public health and consumer protection, and had the privilege of working with some of the state's finest lawyers and the attorneys general themselves. Excuse me. So I'll stop there.
It is just amazing the intersections between your life and Bessie's, and there is no better person on the planet to tell her story. So it's just amazing how that's worked out. Seth, I want to give you the same opportunity if you'd like to talk about your faith and how it's influenced the work that you've done and your chosen career.
Well, I think it's really about my I would say my personal story. My father is a refugee from the Holocaust. He was very active in the work of the civil rights movement. He was a member of one of the first integrated fraternity at the City College of New York. He attended Howard University for medical school, and because he really believed firmly in the notion of America being a place for all of us and for people working and living and studying side by side. On my mother's side, similar stories. My grandfather serving as an officer in World War II, and on the ship that's written about in Ruth Gruber's book, Haven, bringing in refugees from Europe into the country. So I know very well from that personal story, and I've always taken very seriously the commandment, and the most often referenced commandment in the Torah, which is to welcome the stranger, because we were strangers once. And I think that applies not just strictly, as many people do, to the issue of immigration, which of course it does, but also just the notion of understanding the humanity in one another, in being cognizant of who your neighbor is, and making sure that you take that very seriously and very much to heart. So I've always been inspired to want to be able to do that kind of work. For me, it really is inspired and informed by my Judaism.
Thank you, Seth, for sharing that about your family. I mean, I think most Jewish families, have a similar story to tell of, at some point back in the family tree, facing discrimination and persecution. I think of my great-grandparents who were Orthodox Jews in Latvia, who faced persecution 100 years ago, and it brought them to this country through Ellis Island. And now I look throughout my family tree and I see, people who have chosen to become social workers or foster parents or work in refugee resettlement. As you were mentioning, Seth, I'm a prosecutor, so I'm the bad guy in the family, but many other people, really have picked up that thread of looking out for the downtrodden and the least among us. So there's really a clear line, I think, between the work that people do in the social justice space and some family motivation at some point. Seth, I want to stick with you on this. The FBI recently published its annual crime report. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the disturbing rise in hate crimes, including anti-Semitic incidents. I believe hate crimes are now at their highest rate in over a decade. And I know this is a main focus of ADL. So can you kind of give us the lay of the land of what you're seeing out there?
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, here's the next slide. So this is actually an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents that ADL produces. We take incidents that are reported to us directly through incident reports through our, where we have an online portal where people can report incidents that may occur, as well as incidents that we learn through law enforcement or through the media. And ADL has been conducting this research every year for the past 4 decades. Now these incidents are, they may include forms of harassment, for instance, that are legal expressions. Somebody who shouts at somebody in the street an anti-Semitic slur, but it also includes violations of the law, whether it's vandalism or forms of assault. And what you see here are the last 10 years of anti-Semitic incidents, the total number of anti-Semitic incidents that we've tracked. Now, the last year that we have available is for 2019, and you can see that it was not only the high mark, a very sad marker and distinction, but it was actually the most anti-Semitic incidents we've ever tracked in any of the 40 years that we've been doing this work. You can also see that the 2 years prior, so really those 3 years together, the number of anti-Semitic incidents really jumped precipitously. And we've seen just really an explosion of hate. Now we also track anti-Semitic attitudes. We don't have time to get into that discussion tonight, but typically anti-Semitic attitudes are around the low teens, 12, maybe 13%, give or take a few percentage points in any given year, particularly over the last 2 decades. And yet that's remained flat and constant. Now that's pretty good for a society to have that small of a fringe having deeply anti-Semitic beliefs. And yet in a country the size of America, we know that that also translates to about 30 million people or more who hold deeply anti-Semitic views. And what we've been seeing lately is people willing to act out on those views, emboldened to act out on those views, and finding different ways to act out on those views. So next slide. So here we see some examples, some recent examples, and I wanted to particularly focus on some of the issues that we've seen relating to the pandemic, and also relating to ways in which it's being connected to other forms of hatred against other communities, given the subject of tonight's talk. So you see on the right side, a flyer that was produced by racists, and they did such a credible job of imitating a CDC warning that the CDC felt it necessary to make sure that people understood that this was false, that this was disinformation, and make sure that they understood that this is something that was really an ugly expression of bigotry. So you see, it talks about what to do if you have, if you get COVID-19, and the targets are Muslims, Jews, other ethnic minority groups, people in public transit, so people who are required to take public transport, really sort of the typical targets that you might see of racists and in particular white supremacists and white nationalists. You see also the next to the left, the black and white poster that it takes its name from a neo-Nazi, which actually originated with a Nazi group, Corona-Waffen, and it says "Cough on your local minority." The sign that's carried by one of these demonstrators at a demonstrating against some of the restrictions that were put in place for the pandemic, and also ways in which it's some of this bigotry is really targeting immigration and immigrants in particular. It's this notion that we understand that hate rarely confines itself to one community. Again, another reason why in Judaism we understand that it's important to speak out on behalf of others, because we also know that that's also speaking out on our own behalf, either literally or more broadly. Okay, next slide. And we know that it's not limited to the real world. This is a screen grab from the most popular game on Nintendo system right now, Animal Crossing. You can tell by the graphics that this is really intended for young children, a young audience, and yet somebody has taken the opportunity to use the gaming system as an opportunity to spread a message of hate. So in the anti-Semitic incidents that I showed you before, one incident may target many people. So for instance, we talked about the mass murder at the Tree of Life Synagogue earlier tonight. There have been other incidents like that. That would be considered one incident, although there are many victims. And yet, when it comes to online hatred, unless the hatred is specifically targeting somebody, unless you have a direct message through your Facebook chat in some way or Twitter account that is directly targeting you, and you've reported it to us, or in some way we come to understand it, there's simply too much hate that's out there that's generalized on the internet or in online gaming for us to be able to catalog at this point. We're working on that. We're developing an artificial intelligence system to be able to catalog and understand a snapshot of hate in the online environment, in the virtual environment. But something like this screen grab that you see here would actually not qualify for our audit of anti-Semitic incidents. So it just gives you a small window into just how prevalent the problem is. Next slide. Now we talked about the hate crimes. So here is the statistics from that hate crime report. You see 2019, again, the last year that the FBI and the Department of Justice have provided to us. Sadly, as is typical, the majority of religious motivated hate crimes target Jews more than all other religious groups combined. And again, that last year on record showed a sharp increase over the prior year. Also very disturbing, in 2019, there were the most murders ever recorded. And the only murder in the name of hate that was committed in the state of California was the murder of Lori Gilbert Kaye as she prayed at her synagogue in Poway, California. Here you have a screen grab of ADL's hate crime map. It's an interactive map where you can go online, and I give you the URL, to look at what are the different statutes in the different states. You can see that we've color-coded them for you. This is actually an older screen grab because you'll notice the state of Georgia is in orange. But I'm very proud to say that in the midst of the pandemic, our colleagues in Atlanta were able to help shepherd a hate crime law into to be passed in the state of Georgia. And so Georgia does now have a hate crime law on the books, but still lacking in any form of hate crime protection is the state of Wyoming, Arkansas, Indiana in any real meaningful way, and South Carolina. So again, this is an interactive map on the ADL website. You can go and look at who are the protected classes, whether or not you'll see the different shades of blue represent. Darker blue means fully protected, fully inclusive classes, according to the hate crime statute, and a light blue means that it's not fully inclusive. Typically, there's resistance to protecting people on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, and a situation that we're looking to remedy. There's another tab on this same hate crime map page where you can click on, and you'll have an interactive map of the United States, and you can zoom in on different communities and look at the types of hate crimes that are being committed by community. Whether the types of incidents, the numbers of incidents, you can search by year. You can also look at the types of ideologies that might have been behind hate. And again, going back over the last several years. So I commend that to members of the audience tonight. Next slide, please. And there are other resources that I want to make sure that you're aware of. We have a hate symbols database, which is used by law enforcement. It's a comprehensive gathering of all the different symbols that might be used, include some that are more obvious, like some of these might be recognizable to people who are tuning in tonight, but others like the number 88, which can be code for white supremacists, for 8 being the 8th letter of the alphabet, H being the 8th letter of the alphabet, excuse me. So 88 meaning HH, Heil Hitler. So sometimes if you see that as a tattoo, it could be a symbol for somebody's membership or affinity for white supremacy. Next slide. And then there are a number of free resources that we have on our website, which might be of interest. In the upper corner, you see a screen grab of another interactive map we have, which is called our heat map. It tracks the kinds of extremism and terrorism that have gone on in the United States, different acts, and associated with different types of extremist ideologies. And there are a number of different manuals and documents on our website that are published in different languages as well, including explaining what a hate crime is, both in English and in Spanish, how to talk to children, which is unfortunately, sadly, especially in our interconnected world, an important aspect of confronting hate. Again, both in English and in Spanish. How to respond to hate, so giving members of the community some of the resources, agencies like ADL and others like as was mentioned tonight, SPLC, other agencies that may be able to help people in responding to hate. And again, this is offered in English, Spanish, and in Arabic. So a whole wealth of resources, and including others, as I mentioned before, we have an amicus brief database where you can go back and look at various cases that ADL has brought before the High Court. So I'll just, I think, the last thing I would add is, people often ask, what are some things that I can do? We're looking at, as attorneys, you have the ability to offer your pro bono services either for you or your firm. And I would encourage you to think about ways that you might be able to do that. A number of these cases that I've talked about have required research and the good work of various attorneys and law offices. And most notably, one of the cases that we've looked at and one of the things that we're looking to explore is ways of criminalizing severe forms of harassment online, where in many cases it's a blind spot in the legal landscape. So we actually had a local law firm in the Bay Area, Quinn Emanuel, which did some research on the statutory landscape of online hate. And we're in the process of looking to pass statutes in a number of different states. We've had our first victory in the state of Washington early in the pandemic last year. We've had a bill that was introduced before the California legislature, which we're hoping to reintroduce this year, working in cooperation with Assembly Member Jesse Gabriel from the LA area. Looking at, again, severe forms of harassment. So we're talking about things like doxing, where somebody publicly displays your documents, including the location of where you live, where your children go to school, where you might work, in a way as an effort to harass or intimidate somebody. Swatting, which is masking your number, pretending to call from your location, calling the police there under false pretenses to say that there's an intruder in your home, and police often responding with a SWAT team, which is where this term swatting comes from, and which unfortunately has led to death in the past. So some of these things are not necessarily covered by current statutes, and we're looking to close those loopholes right now. I think the last thing I'll say is just to use your voice. You're all advocates in one form or another. And many times that can be powerful enough. Simply saying, this is not okay with me, raising your hand, standing up, speaking out in different ways. I mean, we've heard about the ways that people did that very heroically and throughout their whole career, like Bessie Margolin tonight. But, there are other ways that just in small situations, whether it's in an online chat, whether it's in some other social situation, when you hear bias or bigotry, using your voice, standing up and speaking up and saying, this is not okay with me. So those are just a few of the ways that I think that people can help. And I wanted to make sure to get into that, because we've talked about a lot of difficult subjects tonight, and we should feel empowered to be able to play our part.
Thank you, Seth, for those resources and the call to action. And sticking on that theme, Stan, you're someone who has been able to really combine legal services work with also being a commercial attorney over the course of your career. So I think you'd be well situated to offer advice to attorneys who are watching this, who want to do something, who feel that call to action, but are trying to figure out the right way to plug in. From your experience, what sort of advice do you have for attorneys like that?
Well, I think to not just fight against anti-Semitism, but join the causes of civil rights and human rights, against racism, against Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, LGBTQ people, Asian people, to stand on the line. When Heschel and King stood together, that was the statement about standing together. To fight against something is one thing, but to fight for something is something else. And I think that's really significant here about what people can do. Lawyers can do, other people can do by joining organizations. Look what just happened in Georgia, of the bringing together of so many communities to change the social fabric of that state by electing a Jew and a Black person to the United States Senate. And I'd like to just finish with a couple of quick comments. First of all, if you want to read the best book about hate crimes on the internet, the book is called Semitism, Being Jewish in America in the Age of Trump by Jonathan Weissman. It's a fantastic book about all the hate crimes that go on the internet. And the other book is about how the evangelical movement has become a Christian white nationalist movement. And that book is called Kingdom Coming. And it was written by Michelle Goldberg, who's now a major reporter. And my final comment is a quote. And this is from Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning by Timothy Snyder, which a lot of people have heard of because he wrote the book On Tyranny. And this is the sentence: there is in fact no way thinking about the world, said Hitler, which allows us to see human beings as human beings. Any idea which allows us to see each other as human beings come from the Jews. And that's why one of the things that needed to happen in Germany, we need to eliminate the Jews if we are going to be, as Hitler said, if we are going to be, we have to fight for the natural order of the world, which is brutal racial competition. The first way to start is to eradicate the Jews, because there are people that believe that treat every human being as a human being. When we can eliminate that, then we can win our fight for national racial competition, which is what's happening in this country right now. And we see that. And that's why I think this program has been a very, very valuable program for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. And I want to direct the final question, at least for me, to Marlene, which is a cue to all of you in the audience that have questions to please submit them through the Q&A. We'll still have about 10 or 15 minutes after this for those. Marlene, I've given everyone else an opportunity to pitch their wares. I do want to note that when Stan started to talk about the best book on the internet, I was going to jump in and say, no, Fair Labor Lawyer is the best book on the internet, which is available on Amazon or through your local bookstore, which hopefully is reopening.
Bookstores, independent bookstores.
Yeah, so start with your independent bookstore, get it there. Even in these COVID times, I believe that Marlene can do book plate signings and things like that for that personal touch. I know at least one person in the audience said, I'm bummed that this isn't in person, so I can't get a wet signature on the page from Marlene for her copy. But Marlene, what lessons do you draw from Bessie's life, especially as it relates to public service?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the plug and thanks for asking. There are lots of lessons one can learn from Bessie's life in general, and I'll leave you to read the book for those that you shouldn't follow, such as having too wild a personal life and passion, and perhaps with married colleagues. But that was also part of the dilemma of her time, that she could not have her career and be married and have a family at the same time. You don't have to follow what she did, but I think really what's important, and something that every member of this audience can take to heart, is that mentors, being a mentor is in fact a wonderful thing, but it is not enough. We have to be champions for other people. We have to stick our necks out for people who are not getting the same fair shake, whether it's in employment, in education, and in any other circles. Bessie could not have been the Supreme Court advocate that she was, and this is just one example, had it not been for Solicitor General Charles Fahey, who saw that she was the best at what she was doing, and he gave her the opportunity to argue for the first time at the Supreme Court, making her only the 25th woman ever to do so. He was sticking his neck out, and solicitors general, one after the other, continued to do the same, including Simon Soboloff, who was a very important mentor to her as well. So the lesson to learn is that being a champion for others, it's almost like the ladder, the Maimonides ladder of charity. The highest thing you can do is to help someone get a job. Think of it in terms of that. And in public service in particular, we've come through such a rough time where public service was given such a bad name. Bessie's story reminds us of the dignity of public service and of law itself when it is done in the finest way and with all that one can bring to it. And I'll leave the final thought that Bessie's life in particular, that you don't have to be a radical, or you don't have to appear to be a radical to do radical things in the world. Show up, be prepared, speak out, use your legal skills, and you can achieve worthy goals. And I think that's what I don't know that Bessie would say that about herself, but it's clear from her life story that those are the lessons that I certainly draw from her very remarkable life. And I did see one question I'll answer very briefly. Someone asked me about Judah Benjamin, and no, I really can't talk about him other than what you could find out there. And the question came in the context of being the first Jewish senator, first US senator, and he caveated that with not Ossoff. What I can tell you about is the second Jewish senator, also from New Orleans, Benjamin Franklin Jonas. And the only reason I know a lot about him is that he gave the dedication speech at the opening of the Jewish Orphans Home in 1856 and returned 50 years later to give another speech for the 50th anniversary. So sorry I can't talk about Judah P. Benjamin, but I'm happy to talk about Benjamin Franklin Jonas. And he was the first practicing Jew in the US Senate.
Excellent history. Thank you, Marlene. A couple of these other questions. Stan, this one is for you. Someone said they tried on Netflix to find Nuremberg Lessons for Today, but wasn't able to find the film searching that way. Do you happen to know if it's on Netflix and what the exact name of it is?
Yes, I have a copy of the film. I know other organizations that have the copy of the film. And I'm trying to remember how it's listed, but it's listed under, excuse me, yes, her name is Sandra Schulberg, Schulberg. Her father and her uncle were the filmmakers that made the original film. They were in the Army at the time. She has it on her website. She's the one that went into the archives and restored the film, had it completely restored, a new soundtrack, and it's narrated, and it tells, but it's the actual film that was done because public domain, and that's how she put it out. And that's how I had met her on a couple of occasions. I saw the film. And what I did was I bought a copy that you can show for free to community organizations. And it's really very worthwhile to do it that way because it stimulates a lot of conversations, especially because the subtitle of the films at the time was called Nuremberg, Its Lessons for Today. And it was supposed to come out like in the late 40s, but here it is now, 2021. Its lessons ring as true now, and maybe more so than any time in recent American history on this.
Thank you, Stan. And a little Googling led me to the website nurembergfilm.org, which looks like the filmmaker that Stan was talking about has a website up there with some public viewings. I don't know that we're going to be gathering in a community space to watch a screening of it for the next few months, but hopefully, later this year we can. Another comment, the book Must Men Hate that Seth mentioned is available on eBay and Amazon. So another plug there for once you have bought numerous copies of Fair Labor Lawyer and given out to all of your family members at the next holidays. Let's see what else. Here's a question, maybe Seth, this is directed towards you. If you could talk a little bit about the threat that white nationalist political violence is posing. I mean, this is something that's kind of ripped from the headlines, although I suspect it's probably been lurking under the surface for a little while.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the question. You may have read in the newspaper recently that Department of Homeland Security issued its first warning regarding domestic terror and sources of terror, and really very frightening. Recall, DHS was created in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and really up until this point has only issued warnings about terror that's emanating from abroad. So think about groups like Al Qaeda, and yet now they've issued this warning that will be in effect. And we're thinking about, when we talk about that kind of a threat, I should add that there is no specific threat that's known at the moment, that neither law enforcement nor I can say the experts from our Center on Extremism have pointed to any specific threat that's emanating from this group. But we do see a lot of that kind of chatter. We hear online in some of the forums and some of the places where they're gathering, even with many groups and individuals being banned from certain of the more popular mainstream social media sites. They have continued to gather in some places that either don't have community standards or very proudly proclaim to be under the banner of free speech, or allowing people to say whatever it is that they like to one another. These become sort of echo chambers of hate, if you will, and places where sometimes people get recruited. We do know that there is some concern about the date of March 4th. This was a date which was originally the inauguration date that changed under when Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president. The date changed to January. So there may be some folks who are of this ideological extremist bent who are looking to that date as perhaps a day to reclaim. And one of the reasons we think about that is, one of the groups that was very active in the attack on the Capitol was a group called the Three Percenters. Their name derives from this myth that only 3% of the population in the 13 original colonies took part in the revolution. And sort of the underlying message being that a very small group of people are all that's necessary to fight for freedom. And so they sort of view themselves in that same vein as fighting for freedom, a very small group that's in many respects under siege, that's fighting for freedom. Their flags, their insignia also use a lot of the Revolutionary War types of symbols, and the original flag of the 13 colonies, the Betsy Ross flag. And 1776 is a call that they often use as one of their codes that they use in referencing the fight that they're undertaking. So we do see that these groups are emboldened, and we saw it very plainly on January 6th, and yet not so surprising, even as it may be shocking. I mean, I will tell you that on January 4th, our Center on Extremism did publish a blog which talked about the potential for violence at the Capitol and in advance of the ceremony that would confirm the results of the election. So it was something that we saw sort of bubbling up to the surface that we had written about. You can still read that blog on our website, adl.org. And so, it really is of concern. But I do want to add one last thing, which is because I did see some questions about different points of view and where the anti-Semitism is coming from. I just want to remind everybody of both something that I said and something that Professor Deborah Lipstadt has said. She's a noted scholar on anti-Semitism and on the Holocaust. And she talks about when you're confronting anti-Semitism, and I would add, and any other form of hate, if you're not willing to, and if you are not active in calling out the hate that comes from your own home, whether that's your political home, some other form of institution, your political leanings, if you're not calling out the hate that exists in your space, then you're not serious about calling out hate. Then you're trying to use it as a cudgel against another person. So I would encourage everybody, when I said to speak up, it's increasingly important, vitally important that people, when they do encounter hate, particularly when it comes from your home, whether that's an institution, a club that you're a member of, whether that's a member of your family, whether that's a political party that you're connected to, that you speak up and you confront the hate from within. That's going to be a very powerful message that's going to push back against the hate, much more so than from the outside. And just, an important reminder for all of us to keep in mind.
Good.
Thank you, Seth. That seems like the perfect note on which to end this evening. Thank you again to Seth, to Marlene, to Stan for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and your inspiration. Thank you to everyone for attending. Again, to our co-sponsors, thank you for helping put this on and promote it. I hope everyone found it as inspiring as I did, and stay safe out there. Have a good night.
Thank you.